In the Middle Ages, danger wasn't just on the battlefield. It was in your kitchen, your bed, your water cup. People died not just from war or famine, but from everyday mistakes, simple choices that seemed harmless, but weren't. From drinking the wrong water to trusting the wrong doctor, medieval life was a minefield of deadly habits passed down through generations. In this video, we'll uncover the small things that got people killed over and over again, and some of them might still be with us today. 1. Drinking from the wrong water source. In medieval times, clean drinking water was a gamble. Streams, rivers, wells, they all looked refreshing on the surface, but many were contaminated with human waste, animal carcasses, or rotting garbage. And without any knowledge of bacteria, people had no idea that the very water they drank to survive could slowly kill them from the inside out. It was common for villages to dump waste into the same rivers they used for cooking and drinking. Chamber pots were emptied into alleyways that drained straight into public wells. Livestock roamed freely, defecating near water sources. Rain would wash all of it downstream right into someone's cup. The result? Chronic illness, vomiting, fever, diarrhea, and death. And it wasn't just the poor. Even castles and manors struggled with contaminated water supplies. Wealth didn't protect you from invisible killers. Wells were supposed to be safer, but if placed too close to a latrine or butcher's stall, they were just as dangerous. There were no water tests, no boiling instructions, just trust and luck. In many towns, people believed water itself was the problem, not what was in it. So some turned to beer or wine, even for children. Low alcohol, small beer, became the safer option not because it was healthy, but because the brewing process killed off pathogens. Ironically, fermented drinks saved lives, while water quietly took them. And when plagues spread, authorities sometimes blamed bad air or evil spirits, never suspecting the real culprit flowed through their buckets and jars. What made this mistake so deadly was its invisibility. The water looked clean, it tasted fine. And by the time symptoms appeared, it was too late. Drinking the wrong water wasn't carelessness. It was everyday life. And for many, it was the last thing they ever did. 2. Ignoring small cuts and scratches. In the Middle Ages, a simple cut could kill you, not because of the wound itself, but because of what followed. Without antibiotics, antiseptics, or even a basic understanding of germs, a tiny scratch from farm tools, firewood, or animal bites could easily become infected. And infections back then weren't just inconvenient, they were often deadly. A small wound might seem harmless on the first day, but by the second, swelling would begin. By the third, the skin could darken. Fever would rise, and sharp red lines might crawl up the limb, clear signs that infection was spreading through the bloodstream. What we now know as sepsis or necrotizing fasciitis was often referred to as bad blood or rotting flesh, and once it reached that stage, the options were few. Either the limb was amputated if someone knew how to do either, the patient was left to deteriorate. And amputation, when attempted, came without anesthesia, sterilization, or proper tools. Bones were broken with hammers. Wounds were cauterized with hot iron. Many died from shock or bleeding before the infection had the chance to finish the job. Tetanus was another silent killer. Known for its violent muscle spasms and eventual paralysis, it often came from puncture wounds, especially those made by dirty blades, nails, or animal bites. There was no antitoxin. Victims would arch backward, jaws clenched so tightly they'd break teeth. Death came through suffocation, and it was slow. People didn't understand what was happening. Many believed infection was a punishment, a test of faith, or simply fate. Remedies ranged from applying poultices made of herbs, clay, or even dung, to bleeding the infected area in hopes of releasing the illness. These treatments usually made things worse. What made this so tragic was how frequent it was. Workers in the fields, blacksmiths, shepherds, cooks, everyone used blades, fire, and tools daily. Everyone got cuts, everyone was at risk. But there was no safety protocol, no soap and water routine, just a quick wipe on a dirty cloth, and the hope that the body would fight it off. Sometimes it did. Sometimes it didn't. And in those cases, what began as a scratch could end in fevered suffering, or the silence of a limb left to rot. 3. Wearing the wrong fabric in the wrong season. In medieval life, your clothes didn't just protect you from the weather, they often determined whether you survived it. But here's the problem, most people didn't have options. And wearing the wrong fabric in the wrong season could turn something as simple as a cold night or hot afternoon into a death sentence. Wool was the most common material, dense, warm, and effective in cold weather. But when it got wet, it became heavy and nearly impossible to dry. A soaked wool tunic in winter didn't insulate, sapped heat from the body, leading to hypothermia, especially in children, the elderly, and outdoor laborers. Linen, on the other hand, was lighter and better in the summer, but it was expensive and not always accessible to peasants. Many wore the same set of clothes for months, patched and repatched, no matter the weather. They couldn't afford multiple layers, breathable undergarments, or anything remotely adjustable. If it rained, they got wet. If it froze, they froze with it. In summer, heavy wool layers caused heat exhaustion, or even stroke, especially for field workers who had no choice but to labor under the sun. Dehydration, dizziness, collapse. And again, without understanding the causes, people just assumed it was bad luck, punishment from God, or a weak constitution. Children, too, were often underdressed or poorly protected, growing fast, outgrowing clothes, and sharing garments with siblings meant their bodies were constantly exposed to extremes. Shoes, or the lack of them, only made things worse. Walking barefoot in mud, snow, or sun-baked earth led to wounds, frostbite, burns, and infections, made worse by poor circulation in wet, cold clothing. Modern clothing lets us regulate temperature, wick moisture, and adjust to weather. Back then, you wore what you had and hoped it didn't kill you. What we now see as a fashion inconvenience was, for them, a matter of survival. Dress wrong, and nature made no exceptions. 4. Living too close to livestock. For medieval peasants, animals weren't kept in distant barns, they were in the yard. Sometimes, they were inside the house. And while this offered warmth, security, and easy access to food or labret, also turned the home into a breeding ground for disease. Cows, goats, chickens, and pigs were valuable. They produced milk, eggs, meat, and wool. In winter, their body heat helped warm cold homes, especially in shared living spaces. But alongside the heat came something else: fleas, ticks, parasites, droppings, and bacteria. The floor of a peasant home was often dirt or packed straw. That straw absorbed animal waste, moisture, and rot, creating a perfect environment for pathogens. Children played on those floors. People ate next to them. No one washed their hands, not because they didn't care, but because the concept of invisible contamination didn't exist. Close contact meant that zoonotic diseases, those passed from animals to humans, spread rapidly. Anthrax, tuberculosis, leptospirosis, and ringworm were just a few of the threats hiding in plain sight. Livestock illnesses could jump to humans without warning, and the symptoms were often fatal or disfiguring. And then came the fleas. Rodents followed livestock into homes. Fleas followed rodents. And fleas, as we now know, carried the bubonic plague. One bite, and your life could be measured in days. Living with animals also meant higher risk of bites, kicks, or goring, especially for children tasked with feeding or herding them. A single wound could become infected, and in the absence of proper treatment, death was a very real possibility. But the biggest danger wasn't one specific disease or injury, it was the constant exposure, day after day, year after year, living inches away from things no one understood and couldn't see. Today, we keep livestock at a distance. We separate animals from kitchens, beds, and children. But back then, Animals were life, and sometimes they were death standing right in the room. 5. Using lead, mercury, and other medicines. In the medieval world, medicine was a gamble, and more often than not, the cure was worse than the disease. Without understanding chemistry or toxicology, many so-called remedies were made from substances we now know are incredibly poisonous. Lead, mercury, arsenic, all used in powders, pastes, and tinctures applied to wounds, swallowed in tonics, or rubbed on the skin. Mercury was especially popular for treating skin conditions and venereal disease. Applied directly to sores, it gave the illusion of improvement, while slowly poisoning the nervous system. Tremors, hallucinations, memory loss, and death weren't linked to the treatment, because people didn't realize the treatment itself was the problem. Lead showed up in everything from face powders to ointments. Women of higher status used lead-based makeup to achieve a pale complexion, unaware that it was silently eroding their organs and brains. Even drinking vessels and pipes could leach lead into food and water. Arsenic was used in small doses as a tonic for digestion or even as a beauty aid. Some believed it gave the skin a healthy glow. What it actually did was slowly shut down the body's systems, one sip at a time. Other ingredients included crushed gemstones, dried lizard parts, ground-up bones, and even human body matter taken from the recently deceased. None of it helped, but belief was strong, and superstition stronger. And for the poor, the medicine was often worse. Mixtures of moldy herbs, spoiled animal fats, or liquids left to ferment in filthy containers. There were no standards, no doses, no oversight. To be fair, some remedies worked, especially plant-based ones passed down through folk knowledge. But they were outnumbered by deadly concoctions rooted in myth, not medicine. The scariest part? People didn't know they were doing anything wrong. They were trying to heal, trying to help their loved ones, trying to survive, and they were poisoning themselves in the process. 6. Trusting the wrong food preservatives. In a world without refrigeration, preserving food was a constant battle and one that medieval people often lost without realizing it. Salting, drying, fermenting, and pickling were the main methods of keeping food through harsh seasons. But when done wrong, these methods didn't preserve life, they quietly prepared poison. Meat was heavily salted and hung to dry, but if the salt was low quality or the meat too thick, it might spoil from the inside out. The outer layer looked fine, while the center teemed with bacteria. Ingesting it could lead to food poisoning, vomiting, fever, and death, often blamed on bad air or curses, not on the meat itself. Grain was stored in sacks or barrels, and if moisture crept in, it developed mold. One type of moldergot grew on rye and other grains, especially after damp harvests. People didn't recognize it. They ground it into flour, baked it into bread, and ate it. Ergot contains alkaloids similar to LSD. Its effects? Hallucinations, convulsions, gangrene, and even death. Outbreaks of ergotism swept through Europe under names like St. Anthony's Fire, turning entire villages delirious, with burning limbs and screaming fits. Pickling was another risk. Vinegar had to be strong enough to kill bacteria, but cheap substitutes like watered-down wine or sour ale didn't work. People reused brine from old batches, letting bacteria and toxins grow unseen. A rotten egg or bit of fish could spoil the whole jar yet still be eaten. Cheese, another staple, could harbor dangerous molds. Butter went rancid quickly, and when famine hit, no one threw food away even if it smelled off or looked strange. There were no expiration dates, no warning labels, just trust and tradition. If the food didn't kill you that day, it was safe. The real danger wasn't starvation. It was eating what you thought would save you, and having it destroy you from the inside out. 7. Staying indoors too long during winter. Chronic smoke inhalation led to persistent coughing, asthma-like symptoms, eye irritation, and respiratory infections. In children and the elderly, it was especially dangerous. What we'd now call indoor air pollution was, for them, just everyday life. But the problems went deeper than just smoke. Medieval homes, especially among the poor, were tightly enclosed during winter to trap heat. That meant doors were sealed with cloth, windows were shuttered, and even the smallest drafts were blocked using straw or mud. The result was an atmosphere thick with soot, moisture, and stagnant air. Day after day, families breathed in the residue of open fires that burned wood, peat, or even dried animal dung fuels that released high levels of particulate matter and toxins. There was no chimney in most peasant homes, especially in earlier centuries. The smoke simply drifted upward, darkening the thatched roof beams and lingering in the air like an invisible fog. Children grew up wheezing before they even learned to speak. This constant exposure led to chronic lung damage, weakening the immune system, and making even mild colds deadly. Respiratory illnesses like bronchitis and pneumonia were common, and tuberculosis, though its cause was unknown, thrived in these dark, enclosed environments. The floor was often packed earth, damp from snow tracked in, or from condensation building up inside. Mold thrived along the base of the walls. Bedding, stuffed with straw or old rags, absorbed the moisture and turned into a breeding ground for bacteria and fungi. Every breath drawn inside those homes carried a little bit of the illness forward. The damage wasn't just physical. Weeks or months spent sealed indoors, unable to breathe fresh air or escape the constant darkness, led to psychological strain, especially for those already weak or ill. Some experienced winter depression or hallucinations from smoke exposure, though at the time, these symptoms were often interpreted as spiritual or moral failure. And the irony was cruel. Families were staying indoors to protect themselves from the cold, but in doing so, they created a trap. A sealed box filled with fire, fumes, and invisible threats. And they had no idea. There was no word for carbon monoxide, no understanding of mold spores, no concept of long-term lung damage. Just a brutal routine. Close the doors, light the fire, and hope spring came before the cough got worse. 8. Believing in the wrong medical advice. In the Middle Ages, medicine wasn't based on science. It was based on tradition, superstition, and hierarchy. And following the wrong advice could turn a minor illness into a slow, painful death. Doctors believed in balancing the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Illness was seen as an imbalance, not an infection. So treatment often meant bleeding the patient, sometimes multiple times, to restore balance. Fever, cut a vein. Headache, cut another. Even weak children or pregnant women were bled. And if bleeding didn't help, there were other options: burning herbs to purify the air, attaching amulets, drinking mercury, or applying crushed insects to the skin. Much of this advice came from priests, barbers, traveling healers, or self-taught physicians who had no real understanding of the body, but people believed them. They had no better option, and fear is powerful. Worse yet, some ailments were blamed not on nature, but on sin or spirits. Children who had seizures might be considered possessed. Those with birth defects could be labeled cursed. And instead of care, they received isolation or exorcism. Women faced unique risks. A young girl showing symptoms of illness might be diagnosed with womb wandering, a belief that the uterus moved around the body causing chaos. The solution? Foul smells to drive it back into place. Others were told to marry quickly, as marriage and childbirth were considered cures. Even when natural remedies were available, herbs like yarrow, garlic, or willow bark, they were often dismissed in favor of more dramatic and dangerous treatments. The tragedy wasn't just the lack of knowledge. It was the certainty behind the advice. People trusted what they were told. They followed instructions. And in doing so, they walked willingly into worsening illness. Sometimes, they died not because no one tried to help, but because everyone thought they were helping. Deadly habits, quiet deaths. We imagine the Middle Ages as brutal. But sometimes, what killed people wasn't a sword or a plague. It was a routine, a habit. A daily choice they didn't even know was dangerous. Drinking water that looked clean. Trusting a healer who sounded wise. Wearing the wrong fabric. Sleeping too close to the fire. Doing what everyone else did. Because that's how it had always been done. They didn't die from recklessness. They died from what was normal. And the scariest part? We still do this today. Habits we never question. Advice we follow blindly. Risks we've forgotten how to see. So maybe the lesson isn't how far we've come. Maybe it's this. What are the medieval mistakes we're still making without even knowing it?